And of course they kept it chewed right down nice. And we look forward to having those people out there and watching the kids play in the lower part of the dam where they used to look under rocks and find a crawfish. And once in a while a snake would come out and you'd hear the girls scream and run.
We still do that. We see snakes.
Okay. I'm sorry, you're the one girl.
Ella couldn't get on webkins.
Yeah. I think there might be something wrong with her camera or something. Okay, we are ready. John, I'm going to go over here, and I have a microphone so I can speak to you, and I'll just say something like, you can start now, and if you would just wait, like 5 seconds and talk to that camera. Okay? There we go.
I think I'm about the 9th generation from the Hart that signed the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
Okay, you can begin.
Hi, my name is David Blackwell. I'm a member of the Hopewell Township Historic Preservation Commission, and we're starting a project to interview Hopewell area farmers and folks who have lived here for a good long time as to the kind of lives they lived and what farming was like and what business was like over a period of 75 or 80 years from the present back into the 1920s. And we're beginning our series of interviews with Mr. John Hart, whose family, well, to begin with, whose name has been in this township, I think, without interruption for over 300 years, and whose business, Rosedale Mills, also will take us back in time to the 1910 period and even before. So we'll start talking with Mr. Hart. Now, I'll confess that I had a short meeting with Mr. Hart last night, and he told me lots of wonderful things. So I thank you for that, John, and I thank you for coming in today to help us start our project.
Glad you asked me, Dave.
Good, good. To begin with, I mentioned your name. I know that the first John Hart came to Hopewell Township around 1700, and so therefore it's been 300 years. And I don't think I have to do any research to be sure that there was always a John Hart in Hopewell Township, and the current one is your son, who has the Rosedale Mills store, which you own, on Route 31 north of Pennington. And that name Rosedale is a specific location, and I thought that we perhaps could get to that pretty soon, but maybe first we'll ask you when and where you were born.
I was born in Pennington in 1925, February the 26th, on Route 31, which my grandparents owned the farm, which is now built up with retail stores, and one of them is Goebel's. In back, the barn is still standing, one of the few big barns left, and I don't know whether it'll be torn down or restored, but I understand it has been sold.
Yeah, I think the gentleman who owns the winery.
The winery has bought it.
Yeah, yeah. So these are the red barns that are very close to the road.
That's right, Dave.
On the east side of Route 31, just a little south of the car wash.
Right.
Yeah.
And my folks, or grandfather and father, farmed both sides of the road, all the way to Wissamonsa Road, and almost to Titus Mill Road.
And the present store, the Rosedale Mills, is just a little north of Titus Mill Road.
Just a little north on the corner. That was one time when I was a youngster, that was the Titus farm, part of the Titus farm, which my son lives on. The railroad divides the farm, and it was owned by the Tituses and then later sold to.
So were you born at home or were you born in a hospital?
I was born in McKinley Hospital.
Ah, okay. That was in Trenton?
In Trenton.
Yeah. Now, very early in life, you told me you moved over to a place on Stony Brook on the western side of Hopewell Township, actually in the northern edge of Lawrence.
Dave, I moved over when I got married. I moved to a farm on Pretty Brook Road, which is in Lawrence Township. I lived there for 6 years, and as a caretaker and farmer. And I left there and built a house on Carter Road.
But when you were younger, about 6 or 7 years old.
I was 6 or 7. I went to live with my grandparents
Yeah.
on Rosedale Mills on Carter Road. And I lived there until I was 18 years old, and worked at different farms around the area, worked for my grandfather, and that's how I come to know your father, and enjoyed life immensely,
Yeah.
living
yeah.
on Stony Brook.
Right. We talked about Stony Brook and the
We used
wonders
to-
of Stony Brook.
We had great hockey games there.
You mentioned Sunday morning.
Sunday mornings.
You went out and all the guys from the neighborhood came down to the brook. And
Yep.
Was it rough and tumble?
It was rough and tumble.
Uh-huh.
Rough and tumble. And most of those guys are all gone now. And it was something we looked forward to. We hoped we would sweep and clean the ice, and I guess sometimes the women would come around and make hot chocolate, and I guess we played for maybe 3 hours. I was so tired that we could hardly get off the ice.
So that was your recreation during the week?
That was the recreation. We looked forward to that.
Yeah. Now, what was your grandfather's name?
Joseph Hunt, J.R. Hunt. And he was born in Hopewell Township on Poor Farm Road. His father was Price Hunt. He bought the Rosedale Mills in 1903
Okay, so that's the Rosedale Mills on Carter Road.
on Carter Road.
Was that section of the town, of the area that was called Rosedale?
That was called Rosedale. And it was hard to tell where Rosedale started and stopped. And there was about 11 houses in a group. And we call that Rosedale, and everything around it, the church, the one-room school, and the Hune Orchards, Naples Orchard, and even down on AT&T property, everybody would mention it as Rosedale.
So you started working for your grandfather pretty early at the mill.
I had my chores to do when I was about 10 years old. Of course, we had chickens and we had a few cows and sheep. My job was to collect the eggs, feed the chickens, in my younger days. And it got so that I had to do the milking, and always kept the wood box full
For the house? Or?
for the house.
And what kind of business did the mill do?
The mill was a grist mill. We ground, I can't remember making flour, but he used to make flour earlier. But we had many grists. A grist is where the farmer brings their corn, their oats, their wheat in and grinds it. And we put it in bags for them. They take it back. Sometimes it's exchanged for branded feeds and different things like that. But that was a business that was very good around in the early 1900s. And as the farms were sold and the houses, the farmers were out of business, there wasn't much, and more modern equipment, the farmers got their own equipment to do their own grinding. There wasn't much left for the grist mill other than to sell maybe branded feeds already manufactured.
But you said people would bring bags of...
Corn, oats, wheat, and have it ground. And we used to grind it and mix it. And I did that when I bought the business too. I was a little more modern because I used to put concentrates with it and put molasses onto it. And that was a very good way to get some of the farms where grist mills didn't have molasses machines.
Oh, that was a way to keep some business.
Yep.
Was the corn that was cob corn?
Cob corn, yes.
Yeah,
was
so
cob.
that would be stored in people's barns. And
Yep, in the corn crib, they would shovel up maybe 20 bags, and either they had a horse and wagon to put it on or an old truck, and they would bring it in. We would grind it, and they would wait for it, and we'd put it back on their wagon or truck. And
Now, what was that corn for, that ground corn?
that was for their cows, their chickens, mainly chickens and cows. The horses, they ate corn on the cob as it was. And we used to use a little bit of protein, and I can remember my grandfather later on getting a concentrate that the farmers liked to put into it, so we didn't have to put in so many pounds of salt, so many pounds of calcium, so many pounds of this and that. And we just dumped 1 bag of concentrate to every 10 bags of their grist and made the right protein for a cow that was milking.
And then you said oats.
Oats.
What were the oats for?
That was ground right in. That was ground in.
Oh, that was mixed in with the corn?
Yep. Now, when I had my Princeton mill, I still had quite a few grists. And I had a roller mill, and they used to bring oats in, and I crushed it. I didn't grind it because it made too much dust. It went through a roller, and I mixed that in with their grist and put molasses onto it. And that was...
And then the wheat, you said also wheat.
Wheat, they ground a little bit of the wheat in with it because they didn't have enough wheat to really to take it to a market someplace, or there wasn't any demand for soft wheat. And they had bags around from threshing to feed their chickens, and maybe they had more than what their chickens needed, and they would just grind that and put that right in with their dairy, or we ground that especially where they were feeding pigs. The pigs did good on ground wheat.
I see. So people kept they kept a store of corn and oats and wheat in their barns all year round.
You went to a farm, you would see a corn crib. Corn crib was a long building, had a lot of slats in it where air could go through it and dry the corn. It had to be dried. It couldn't put it without air because it would get moldy. And of course, moldy was no good for grist work.
And then these folks would come year round to the mill.
Maybe every 3 weeks they would bring a grist in.
And when you say grist, you're referring to the stuff that they brought.
They brought in.
But I also heard you say it in the sense of they were your customers.
They were.
So you referred sometimes to a customer as a grist. It was somebody that you had that would bring their stuff in.
And they used to list all these mills. There was many of them on Stony Brook. My grandfather told me how many it was on Stony Brook one time. They were all called grist mills. And it was mostly all pertaining to grinding. And they had different types of power to grind. Some had overshot water wheels, some had undershot water wheels. And my grandfather had an overshot when he first bought the place in 1903. In 1917, he put in a turbine, and that was put into a section under the mill where water gushed in and went through a circular turbine that had fins and got the power by going through these fins and on out to the bottom, on down Stony Brook. And that was a great relief because it was a lot of upkeep to big water wheels, the wooden overshots.
So a big wooden water wheel was the traditional way. That was the old-fashioned way. And the turbine was sort of like
that was more modern.
More like a wheel laid on its side under the water.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And so once the water got through there, as the wheel turned, it would bring more water in. So it was sort of a multiplier effect.
That's right.
Under the water. So.
And the more body of water you had in back of it, the faster, the more power you would have.
Now, did that turn all the time then?
No, you had a great big wheel up on the ground level that opened the fins and shut the fins. Once the fins were shut, your mill would slow down and stop as it opened it. It was a sound that's unbelievable when you had an old mill that was full of gears and shafts and belts, and when you started, it would start real slow, and you hear creak and crack, and you try not to have any grinders on or anything like that. You want to get your speed up before you throw a belt tightener on a grinder. And like I was telling you, in the cold weather, it would freeze, and you'd have to chip the ice out around this turbine shaft.
The shaft that came up through the water.
To get your movement.
So when the folks came in, you'd start the mill for them.
We'd start that almost, just about every day. We would be grinding or cracking corn or grinding to make our own feed. The mill just ran every day, I guess we started it.
Now you said your customers came from up by Hopewell Borough, and you mentioned Fred Bird at one point. Oh, that would be over.
Fred Bird didn't come until I had the business in Princeton.
I see.
And then I just delivered him concentrates, and he had his own portable grinder. He did his own grinding.
So in the early days, the customer, how far around did the customers come from?
Well, they came from as far as Penn's Neck, all through the Lawrence area. Some of them from Ewing, Federal City Road, Hopewell, Pennington. There was probably 4 farms just on Carson, which I was on Cold Soil Road now, that we used to grind for.
So, and were you one of the few people, or the few mills still in operation in those days?
We were at that time, and then other mills opened. The Farmers Cooperative in Trenton was the big feed mill. T.P. Reed in Pennington was a big mill. There was 2 in Hopewell, Van Dorn's feed and lumber and coal. There was in Pennington, it was just T.P. Reed. Lawrenceville, there was Mercer Feed. In Lawrence Station was Scheidler Brothers. In Princeton, Grover's Mills was Grover's Mills.
So this was a time when there were still a number of dairy farmers, and they needed the grist.
When I was young, yes.
Yeah, they needed the grist for to feed their cows.
Lots of dairies, lots of dairies.
And how was milk sold in those days?
They were sold by cans, in the can, and the cans, we were involved in that in later years too, that we used to truck the milk to Castania, and we picked up the milk from the farmers. And then in later years, they got into bulk milk. We picked that up. And we went to several dairies. We went to Cumberland Farms, Johanna Farms, and then the farms started to sell out because they couldn't compete with New York State milk prices, and the big dairies would be buying milk out of state. And the farms just sold to the developers.
Now, as a boy, you told me that your grandfather, J.R. Hunt, liked to keep everybody busy at the mill.
Everybody worked for him. He didn't like to see anybody sitting down. Once in a while, if it was raining real hard, maybe he'd let you rest. But
you said if you weren't doing something with the milling, you were doing something else.
If you don't know what a scythe is, it's a long thing that's got a blade onto it, and he would send us down along Stony Brook to trim along the brook. These different high weeds that grow in wet areas, or if it was a nice day, he gave us a paintbrush and a bucket of paint, and we'd have to paint the buildings.
And before we started today, we were also talking briefly about the picnickers that would come. And what was that all about? Where did people come from for picnicking?
They would come from some of them Granges, different churches, Lawrenceville Church, out of Princeton, Bible schools and different things like that would come out and have a picnic in our meadow, and they just would have a great time out there. They'd like to see the animals, and we had sheep and some cows, and
So they'd be right down by Stony Brook, and they could
right.
stick their toes in the brook as well. Huh?
And on the west side of the mill, we had a nice pasture there, but we had pigs in there. And some of the young people used to like to camp up there. It was nice, but they didn't have the church picnics in where the pigs were. We had a rope hanging in a tree where the kids that used to camp and us local kids used to swing out and dive into Stony Brook. And Stony Brook up there was at least anywhere from 8 to 12 feet deep, with the water backed up. Now,
Yeah, so that was the mill pond. That was the backup from the dam at the mill.
now it's about 3 foot deep right down through the center.
So we aren't holding back as much water as we used to
No
with
way.
all the mills.
No
Yeah.
way. No dams are built now on Stony Brook.
Yeah. Now, when you mentioned the T.P. Reed mill, was that the one on Old Mill Road?
That was on Old Mill Road.
Yeah, that right there where Stony Brook goes across Old Mill Road.
Then there was one off of Titus Mill Road, and I think there was one near Marshall's Corner too.
At the golf course, yeah, there was one.
Yes.
Yeah. So Stony Brook really was, for a long, long time, a source of water power that ground grain and had
Up
a lot.
until-
Yeah.
Up until 1944.
Was when your mill went out of business.
Yes.
Now, another thing you were telling me about was some of the, in your other time, after you did all this work around the mill and played some hockey and so forth, you also talked about working for the other farmers in the area as a boy.
I did. My grandfather wasn't real busy. He would let me go work for these other farmers, and I used to, I guess I worked for every farmer in the area, especially when they used to cut grain with a binder. And they used to make it in a sheath, and you would set it up into I don't know what, they had a name for it.
Well, you mentioned or you mentioned making shocks.
Shocks, in a shock. And I was paid at the time 25 cents an hour, but once in a while, one farmer would give me 35 cents. And that was big money in those days for me, and I was about 16 then. 15, 16, and I had people call that I couldn't set up for because somebody else already engaged me. And I used to be able to set up shocks real fast, and I knew how to cap them so that if it did rain, the water didn't get down into them.
So you mentioned that. You mentioned thinning peaches.
Thinning peaches. I used to thin peaches. I used to thin them with a hand's distance, take the little peaches off.
Okay, so you actually pick early peaches to make more room for the other ones.
So the other ones would grow big.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a job that was very itchy. Oh, the peach fuzz, working in that all day.
So that was, in part, that was on Charlie Maple's
That was
farm,
Charlie Maple's farm.
across from what
Terhune
people now
Orchards,
would
yeah.
know as Terhune Orchards. Yeah.
Yes.
And roughly how many trees do you think he had, or how much time did you spend doing that?
Well, I probably did it for 2 weeks at a time there
In the spring?
in the spring. And peaches were maybe the size of probably the size of a small tomato. And you would take the smallest one off and leave the one big one next to it.
And we talked about the Johnson Trolley. That where did that start and end?
Well, that started in Trenton. I don't know exactly whereabouts in Trenton, but it come all the way down through Lawrence Township and ran across Kirk Road right through the middle of Lawrenceville. It had a little booths at each road for people to wait into. across Carter Road, about 150 feet from Carson Road, or Cold Soil Road. It ran across Rosedale Road as it went into Princeton and Lawrence Township, which was about Province line. It ran it all the way into Princeton and went up Witherspoon Street to Spring Street. And had a great big pole on the back, and when they got to the end of Spring Street, they'd pull the rope and they'd take that thing around and it somehow reversed it. And then they would be back again and ran about, I guess every 3/4 of an hour. You could wait and you'd see it, you'd hear it clonking along.
So that took people from Trenton to Princeton and back again.
Right, and a lot of the kids, we had to go to school in Lawrenceville. We went to a one-room school in Rosedale up to 8th grade, then it was at the 5th grade. But when they eliminated the 3 grades, the 5th grade, they got a bus. And we were picked up by a bus to take to Lawrenceville School. And then for high school, we used to get on the Johnson Trolley, and you'd have to walk from Witherspoon Street up to the high school.
Now, we mentioned the other day Elwood Titus. Do you remember Elwood Titus, who lived?
Vaguely.
Yeah?
Vaguely. And I know all I can remember, I used to see him come in my grandfather's office there at the feed mill, and he always had felt boots on. And my grandfather was one of the farmers or men around that knew him well. I guess he was a widower when he died. They put all his belongings out for a public sale, and I tagged along. I was quite young then, probably 8 or 10 years old, and it was interesting to see all the antiques and different things like that. And I remember they picked up a rug and found a couple dollars underneath of it. And they used to joke about it because Mrs. Terhune was a relative of Elwood Titus's. I don't know whether...
Probably a niece.
Probably a niece.
Yeah. Yeah. So that farm was up on what's now Elm Ridge Road.
Elm Ridge Road.
Yeah, in Hopewell Township. That
Right.
was 60 Elm Ridge Road.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't remember too much about him farming, but the farm was sold to a fellow named Morgan after that. And there was a couple fields that were cleaned off, and he planted some grain into it, and I helped them thrash that grain. That's the only time I ever worked on that farm.
So thrashing grain, that was another thing. That was mostly in late August, or what?
That was usually in late August. The farmers would kind of go together. If a thrashing company would come in, or one of them had a thrasher, he would thrash the other farmers, and they would bring their team of horses over to pick up all the sheaves in the field. And the one nice thing about thrashing, they always had a great big dinner. And everybody that worked there had a big dinner. The wives on these farms would make all the stuff, and it was a fun gathering.
Now thrashing was with wheat. What was that all about?
Well, with wheat, that was used mostly to be sold as flour or for chicken feed, and but most of it would be for oats and wheat. That was one of the cash crops, wheat, for the farmer in those days, more so than oats. They didn't, in this area, raise much rye at that time. Certain places they did because they could sell the rye to some of the liquor companies and stuff like that. Barley, I don't remember that as being a big grain either, because there wasn't any call for much barley around. It was mostly corn and wheat.
But threshing is what? What do you-
Threshing is where they bring in a big machine and take these sheaves and feed it into this thrasher, and it knocks the seed out of the heads of this grain, and it goes down into the bottom of the thrasher where there's a fan blowing that blows the chaff out, and then it jiggles out into a bucket. In those days, it didn't have many augers in some of them, and you dump the bucket into a bag, and that was your clean grain, a bushel measure. That's
Okay.
what they used to put.
So the sheaf was the group of stalks from out in the
All
field.
tied together from a binder.
Pushed through the machine, and you wound up with
it
clean,
was-
clean grain in the pail.
Right.
Yeah.
All that was replaced years later with a combine that thrashed it right in the field.
Okay. We haven't talked about any mischief. Was there any mischief going on in those days?
Oh, we had a lot of mischief.
Yeah.
Halloween, we always used to play tricks with a trolley, and we did grease the rail one time, and they couldn't get stopped. And we used to move a few outhouses and put a few pumpkins here and there.
Yeah, I recently, someone was telling me that the word tictac is actually kind of a local word. And Halloween did involve moving outhouses.
And wagons. And if a farmer left a little buggy outside, he found it a mile away, someplace on somebody's porch, maybe.
Now, there was that story about Herbie Hunt's wagon on top of the shed at the Rosedale Chapel, but you didn't admit to being involved in that.
I think I was involved into it. I think I was involved. Herb was very, he was very excited about that. He called my grandfather, and we moved his outhouse too. And I had a hard time getting enough guys to take that outhouse back and put it back where it belonged. And the wagon was kind of easy to get back.
Now, Herb, at that time, he lived directly across from Terhune Orchards in that small house.
And he was a relative of my grandfather's.
Yeah, well, I think I told you there was a time when my grandfather went to see your grandfather. It was when Elwood Titus had 2 cars with New York license plates parked next to his barn, and we suspected there was some bootleg whiskey being made, and my grandfather came down to see your grandfather, and they made a plan to get Elwood Titus away from the house and called in the state police. So did you ever hear about any making of bootleg whiskey in the neighborhood?
Sure thing. On Bayberry Road, there was a farm there that was rented by a fellow named John Bennett. And evidently, he subcontracted or rented it out to somebody from New York, and they made whiskey into it. And they had a runoff of whatever it is, apples, fermented apples or whatever, into Honey Brook. And it killed all the little fish and the little crawfish and minnows and everything in the brook. And the game warden followed it because some of the bigger fish came down and lodged against the dam. The game warden followed it up and went up Honey Brook, and they found that there was a still in John Bennett's barn. At one time, there was a legal, I guess it was a legal still right at the end of Rosedale Road, the Van Kirk still.
Yeah, Foster Van Kirk.
And I guess they sold whiskey in those days.
Yeah, I think before Prohibition there were licenses. You had to have a license.
My grandfather told me about 2 fellows from Hopewell. They were quite drinkers. Come there in the winter and they got drunk, and they walked and they took a shortcut, and they went through a farm that was owned by the Pearsons, which is to the right of your grandfather's farm on Carter Road, long lane back, and they found both of them in the wagon house had froze to death
Yeah,
from drinking.
and yeah, and we that sort of brings up this, another subject. And as we move on from the time that well, your grandfather sold the mill property in what you said 1944.
1944, he sold it to William Dorman. And I had gone into the service, and most all the young fellows were in the service then. And he was at the age where he could retire. And Dorman ran the business for a short time at Rosedale, then moved it into Princeton, and combined that with a locker plant he had built where farmers would bring their meat in and store it in these lockers. And
Well, what happened to the mill buildings at Rosedale?
my grandfather sold the property to Alfred Steele. He was president of Coca-Cola at the time. He bought the Blackwell farm, the Rosedale Mills, J.R. Hunt's farm, and there was one other piece of ground he bought.
Ed House's property.
Ed House's property. And my grandfather begged him, he said, "Now what are you going to do about the mill?" He said, "I'd like to see it stand." He says, "It will, Mr. Hunt." He says, "I'll fix that." And, well, it wasn't long after he decided that, well, I don't need that old mill anymore to keep up. And I showed you pictures of moving part of the mill over Stony Brook, right through the brook, to the Ed House property, which he lived in for a while. And that was the end of the old mill.
So you said the feed wing of the building.
The feed wing of the building they made a barn out of in the Ed House property.
On the north side of the brook.
Yes.
Yeah. And then tore down the old mill.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was a beautiful old mill with floors that had so many bags drug over them, the knots would stick up. And the floors, some places, the boards were just as shiny and nice. It had big big grain bins where we used to get carloads of loose oats and would dump it into a hole outside, and big auger elevators would take it up, put it in the bin, because we had quite a lot of horse business in those days. We had the Helen Benson that had the hunt club, the Princeton Hunt Club, and all those people had riding horses. We had the ROTC, which was down by Palmer Stadium at that time. There was about
horses.
25 or 30 horses there. There was at in Lawrenceville, the 112th Field Artillery. There was horses there. There were still people using horses for some farm work.
In the 1930s.
So we sold a lot of whole oats.
So you bought those oats? Yes.
In freight car loads. They come from the west. And your father helped unload a lot of them.
Now, somewhere along the line, you all sort of moved toward the trucking business a little bit, and Tom Reed was another guy in the neighborhood.
Tom Reed went in the coal business, and we had the coal business right at Rosedale Mills. And the coal was hauled in from Hazleton and Scranton. And Tom had 2 trucks, and he hauled coal in. And we had 1 dump truck that delivered, had a scissor dump onto it, and we would deliver around to homes and put in their coal bin in their basement. And after a while, he bought a piece of property on the corner of Carson Road and Carter Road and moved the coal business up there after a big fight with everybody. Nobody wanted the business there, but finally he got the business there and had to build a big building to keep a lot of the equipment in so they couldn't see it. But we all us young fellows one time or another worked for Tom Reed.
Now, you were 18, it was 1943. There was a World War going on.
1943.
Yeah, what did you do then?
1943, I enlisted. First, I enlisted in the Marines. I passed my physical, and I come home, and my grandfather got a delay because he wanted me around until he got the business sold and everything. And that was 3 months. And then I left for the service and went to Camden, and I was told there's nobody going in the Marines or the Navy or the Coast Guards. Everybody's going in the Army. Well, I said, here's the papers I got. And I said, that doesn't make any difference. They were getting ready for the invasion. And so I said, okay. And there was a fellow standing behind me, and I said, and he wanted to go in the Navy. And I said, well, we're going to go in the Army. You're going to go in the Army too, aren't you? He says, yeah, I don't like that much. He said, there's a sign there that said, join the Army Airborne and get $50 more a month. So we broke rank and went in and said, hey, we'd like to join this here and get $50 more. We don't have to do so much marching.
Did you know you were going to be jumping out of airplanes?
Never thought much about it. Went in the service, took my basic training in Macon, Georgia, and the whole company I took with left. And they called the two H's out, Hart and Huff. They said, no, you're not going home. You're going to Fort Benning for parachute training, airborne training. So we went to Fort Benning and had 5 weeks of training, and I went back for 2 weeks advanced training, and then I was shipped overseas.
So in the end, you went by boat overseas?
I went by boat.
And where did you land in Europe?
I went into into England, and from there I went to Southampton, and went in as through France as a replacement in the 101st Airborne. I never made any parachute jumps in combat, but I made 13 of them before I went.
So when you came back, that's when I was impressed by a lot of things you had to say, because you've been farming on your own account and you've been in business
When I come back, I talked to the fellow that had bought my grandfather's business, and my grandfather was a pretty good stockholder in the John W. Eshelman Feed Company out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I knew some of the salesmen and some of the executives, and I was always interested in feed and everything, so they hired me as a salesman, and I was a salesman there until 1950, and another friend of mine was also a salesman, that was Wayne Savage, lived here in Pennington. His father farmed my folks' farm, and he was a territorial salesman for North Jersey, and I was for South Jersey, and I also had Bucks County. And I bought the business back from Mr. Dorman, that bought it from my grandfather, took a friend that I went through high school with to run it. I was still going to sell feed for a while until we got a little more money, and hired a man that I knew to work with us, and he was also an ex-Marine. And one day they said, we got called back in the Korean War. What are we going to do about the feed business? I said, well, I'll come back in. So I quit my feed selling job. I went back
and ran the business.
And ran the business. I had to get I had some farmers help me, and I had lots of help.
So you were back at the helm of Rosedale Mills once
Right,
again.
right. And I,
When did you bring the business over to Pennington?
1976, brought it over, still had the one in Princeton. Outgrew the one in Pennington. My sons weren't with me until near the end of the time in the Pennington store, and we had outgrown that. And
Now, you mentioned Wayne Savage. He had a feed store right on the corner.
he had
there.
it right on the corner, and he sold his property before to Exxon. And I bought the property that was the Flemington Egg Auction, and later on it was owned by the Building and Loan. They were going to put their office there. I bought it, and Bill Hart was, I think he was one of the executives in Building and Loan, and I bought that property.
So that property was facing Route 31.
That was facing 31.
Kind of behind Jan's Sweet Shop, if
Right,
that's something that
right.
everybody would know where
Well,
it is.
Jan's Sweet Shop was part of Wayne Savage's, and that was moved back. That was closer to the road.
Oh, that building is actually part of Wayne's?
Part of it.
Oh, okay.
Feed store. And he also did grist too. And we both bought them about the same time.
So in '76, you set up a Pennington branch of Rosedale Mills.
Oh, he bought that about 1950, about when I bought the one in Princeton. Because when I built the one in Pennington, Wayne had already sold to Exxon. And that's why I built there. And then my son was hauling milk from the farmers to the creameries. The farmers were disappearing, and he wanted to come into the business. And I said, well, we can't expand here. And the bank had been empty up on the corner of Titus Mill and 31, or Trenton. It was Broad Street National Bank, and that bank never did too much. And that property came up for sale, and we bought that property. But we only bought it knowing that we could get a light on the corner of Titus Mill Road. We got the light on Titus Mill Road because we had a hunting club down to the farm, and one of the fellows that in our hunt club had something to do with lights, and he worked on it hard to get a light. With mobile using that road too, they needed a light.
Yeah.
And we got the light, then built the building. And it's a building, my son is quite involved with Purina, and I think he's on some kind of executive committees with them, and they come up with this idea of having American country stores. They were going to build 50 of them, the plans, and we were the guinea pig. They did everything but give us money. They told us what to do and everything.
Like a franchise type thing.
Right, like that. We built the American Country Store, and it's one of the biggest ones that they built in the East here. And then my other son, he was always interested in motors, cars, trucks, and stuff like that. And we bought the Ken Paul business next door, where they sold security things, and set up the lawnmower business, and he runs that. My youngest son, John, runs the feed business.
So that's really just up the road from your father's house and your grandfather's house?
Right.
Right back in the same area after...
I remember one time when I was a young fellow, I told him, you know, sometime I'm going to get in the farm machinery business over on 31, up someplace around where my grandparents used to have a farm, and that was probably when I was in the early 20s. And I almost did it. Almost did it. And but that I've always been involved with agriculture some way or another.
So I want our viewers or our listeners to know that from the time that your grandfather Hunt bought the Rosedale Mills in 1903. Here it still is in 2009 on Route 31 in Hopewell Township. So that's been a family business, in and out of the family a little bit, but
Right,
been a family
right.
business for a century.
Right, and probably will be for some time yet.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I have a grandson in the business too now, and another grandson that's coming along. And he's only 10, but he's quite active when he's around there.
Now, you stayed involved in agricultural organizations.
I did. I belonged to Princeton Agriculture. I was a 4-H leader. I was on the 4-H advisory board, and I went to Dr. Salisbury's poultry school in Iowa, and always been very active in.
And even now, you're in a few organizations.
Yes,
Yeah.
still in Princeton Agriculture, which is 140 years old.
Now, you were mentioning on Route 31 a couple of things. Also on the farm, on the Hart farm that went up as far as Wissamonsa Road and almost to Titus Mill on the east side of the highway. You mentioned there was a grove in that area somewhere where people would have picnics.
The Grange owned a piece of property where Bish's lawnmower place is, or where the appliance repair is.
Yeah, that small appliance thing, yeah.
They owned a strip of ground down there. I think they owned it, but they had a little building there, and the Grange used to hold their picnics and things into
And
it.
what was it? What was the Grange?
Pardon?
What was the Grange?
The Hopewell, or Pennington Grange, that's a bunch of farmers that are all connected with agriculture. Almost all the farmers belong to a Grange.
And then you mentioned another building that stood somewhere along the road there. Small building that you thought was used as a court.
That was on my grandfather's property. It was right at the entrance going into the farm on the right-hand side. It looked like a one-room school. And my aunt told me, in later years, I asked her what that building was for, because I'd been in it a couple times. And she said they used to hold court into it. And if they had people that needed help in the township, or they would, the body, the council or whatever would meet in there and decide whether they should go to the up to the poor farm. They couldn't take care of themselves, or things
Now,
like that.
where did that stand?
That was on 31. That's was right.
East side or west side?
That would be on the west side, right by the barn. Right by the barn. And it was a nice building. It was about like a small one-room school. It had the oiled floors and the benches, and it had the banisters up where probably the officers of the court would set up with a table there. And they moved it probably maybe while I was in the service or something like that. I never found out whatever become of that building. And I never really ever knew anybody that could verify that that's what it was used for a court.
What time period do you think it might have been used for a court building?
Early 1930s, late 1920s.
I've heard mention of Black Mike.
Well, he was Black Mike. He was the judge, and he lived on the Erickson farm on Wissamonsa Road, and he was a stickler, and he was in later years.
That was later than the building that you're talking about?
Oh yes, much later.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He was, and he lived on a farm that my second grandfather, my grandmother Hart, married Harry Erickson, and he was a farmer on Wissamonsa Road, and his farm joined up with my grandfather's farm, and that's right in front of the Harbat farm.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where Black Mike lived. A very nice house, still there.
Yeah, that one that's close to the road, brick.
Yes.
All right. Well, we certainly have enjoyed being with you today. You know, you've done all the talking, and there's been some great stories told, and some good views.
I love to reminisce about old times. And I could go on and on all day long about a lot of things.
Yes, yes.
I went to the Pennington School in 39 and 40. Didn't much care for that at those days. It was hard getting there. And then I finished my education in Princeton High, and then I went 2 years to Rider College on a GI Bill.
Oh, another thing you had mentioned about Stony Brook, or at least about you know, life in your early years, you mentioned traps.
Oh yeah, trapped along Stony Brook. And at the time during the early part of the war, when I was probably about 16, there used to be a lot of muskrats. And we got as much as $6 a pelt for muskrats. And that was a lot of money. Some mornings, maybe some mornings I would have 3. And we did set some for skunks and different things like that. And I had a trap set right over the hill at the end of our driveway in a hole in the ground. I put a trap on a great big log, and I used to look at that when I went out to get the school bus. And I saw something, that the log had moved a little bit, and I looked down the hole, and there was something white. And I said, oh my gosh, I must have got somebody's cat. And I reached down and grabbed it by the tail and pulled it out of the hole, and it was a skunk. And needless to say, I didn't go to school that day. My grandmother wouldn't let me. She brought clothes out to me in the garage or in the barn, changed my clothes. And I was kind of sick too.
Now, where did you, well, my father told me he trapped muskrats as well in the same area before he caught the school bus in the morning. He'd check his traps.
Yeah, this was right after your dad. I took over after your dad.
Where did you sell them?
Sold them to, there was a fellow who used to come around, he was up in Three Bridges, he used to buy them. And then I sold them to another fellow by the name of Harry Baldwin that lived down on Route 31. And he was a bachelor, lived by himself. And I used to go in there and take the pelts in. And one time, I took him down after school, it was dark, I know, and on my bicycle, and he was eating. And he said, come on in, Hart. So I went in, and when he got finished eating, I told a lot of people that. He took a piece of bread and cleaned the plate up and turned the plate upside down.
That was the washing of the plate.
That was washing of the plate. And a lot of times he'd be eating an apple, and if you took a skunk in, he'd run his hand through that old skunk and still be eating the apple. But that was something most all the country boys did, a lot of hunting and trapping. Because there was a lot of hunting in those days.
And fishing.
And fishing.
Was Stony Brook had some fish in it at one point?
You bet. And deep, some pockets had great big bass into it. And
always a little something different for the dinner
you
table.
knew where they were at. They used to stock it with trout. And my grandfather was very particular who used to come trout fishing there and made sure that they took all their lunch bags and cans and stuff. And sometimes they would get hiding and digging behind some place to get some worms to run out of bait. And he didn't like that very much.
You said when the mill business was going in the early years that a few people would bring their grist in with a horse and wagon or like that. But what about the first cars and trucks? What did you see in the early years? What did people have?
Well, there was old trucks. There was, like the one I was telling you about was an old school bus the fellow made a truck out of, cut the body off of it. And then there was old Model T trucks. sometimes you had to tow them when they left the store and couldn't get them started. But there were still a few people that used to come in with a team of horses and a wagon
This
with
is,
grain.
again, this is the mid-1930s.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that Model Ts could be converted to
To
tractors?
tractors. Yeah, there was a conversion kit that Ford had. The Reed brothers had the first one in the neighborhood, and that you could see the steam coming out of it all day long, and it seemed to work for them though.
So Russell and Gideon Reed lived up the hill on the,
They sure did.
on the east side, and
Yeah,
they had one of those. You were saying that they were only getting a couple of lengths of the field.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
They'd stop and put water into it, and they were always arguing with one another who was going to go get the water.
Yeah.
That was the Pearson farm.
Well, very good. It's been great talking with you.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, for me as well.
I hope
think
I
this-
can help you more in the future. If you,
Okay, well, I think you can. I think we'll do this again.
Okay, very good, Dave.
Okay, it's been great meeting you and
Same here.
getting to know you and starting to work together.
Okay,
All right, thanks.
okay. All right,
Wonderful.
is that what you wanted?
That was perfect. That was just